This week, we get to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart and an area that I've done a fair amount of research in. We're going to look at how forests are affected by elevated carbon dioxide, and then we'll also talk a little bit about Canada's lumber trade. You also have readings this week associated to the lumber trade, and one of your big assignments is really going out and getting more information about the supply chain from a lumber perspective, natural resources perspective, and looking at the different components that forest products play in different sectors. So to start with today, I'm going to talk to you about some of the research that I actually did at Oak Ridge National Lab in what we call a FACE site. So it's free air CO2 enrichment. So these pipes here would blow carbon dioxide across the trees that were inside of those pipes. So there were different sensors, so they could sense the wind direction, and then they'd know exactly which pipes the carbon dioxide should come out of. And there were massive CO2 cylinders over here that piped the carbon dioxide to these areas. And in doing so, we could have a forest where we have trees exposed to regular atmospheric carbon dioxide, and we can have trees exposed to elevated carbon dioxide concentrations within these rings. So we can start to understand what forests in the future are going to do. These are huge scale projects, and one of the ones that you also have to read about this week is called the Duke FACE site. So it's at Duke University, and again, free air CO2 enrichment. I also did some studies at Biosphere 2, and so inside this massive greenhouse-like structure, I was able to manipulate carbon dioxide within that environment to expose trees for their entire life cycle to different levels of carbon dioxide. So we'll talk about those. So again, coming back to where we are at, when we look at global trends, we know that atmospheric carbon dioxide is continuing to increase. We know that the pre-industrial CO2 concentration is approximately 280 parts per million, and we know that now we've actually reached 410 or above parts per million. When I did the study at Biosphere 2, we were actually sitting around approximately 385 parts per million. So I had different mesocosms that slightly elevated and then much more elevated CO2. And we'll talk about that as we go through. A refresher on the carbon cycle. So I just want to remind you guys that we keep talking about fossil fuel burning all the time. And so when we look at the global carbon cycle, forests, grasslands, agriculture, everything that does photosynthesis on the planet takes up approximately 120 gigatons of carbon a year. Then from that, any living organism has to also respire, right? So we actually see a fair amount of respiration coming back at the plant level from the above ground portion. So that'd be approximately 40 gigatons. And we see root respiration coming back at a rate of approximately 23 gigatons. We also have soil carbon. So we've got the carbon locked in soil that microorganisms eat and all that fun stuff, which contributes to soil respiration. And soil respiration is approximately 80 gigatons. So what you see here is that within an ecosystem where humans aren't really involved, we've got approximately 120 gigatons of carbon going in, and 40 plus 80 is 120. We have approximately 120 gigatons of carbon coming out. So one of the things that a lot of people have talked about is, are there ways we can increase the amount of carbon that's taken up or reduce the amount of carbon that's coming out of these systems? Because even really small changes in these numbers would have drastic effects on our global numbers. You know how we keep talking about fossil fuel emissions and how they're just horrendous and they're, putting us into this horrible cycle with global change? What we're talking about on an annual basis is somewhere on the order of 5.3 gigatons of carbon. So it's such a small number compared to photosynthesis and respiration that it's really, if we could come up with mechanisms for sequestering carbon, it's not that massive of an amount that we actually need to be able to sequester. And so this is one of the big things for everyone to consider as we're going through this course. We keep talking about pollution, but in theory, when we look on a global scale, this is solvable if we do the right things and find the right technologies and find ways to prevent further anthropogenic or human-induced challenges for the global atmospheric carbon concentrations. So going back to my studies, so when we look at our studies, what I did was I was able to use stable isotopes, and in this case it was carbon-13 that I used as a tracer. So I could use stable isotopes to label 1 day's worth of photosynthesis and track it through a plant. And not just a plant, sorry, at the entire ecosystem scale. So we could figure out how much goes in, how much comes out, where does it come out, what are the transit times, where does it get allocated, and how does this change under different carbon dioxide concentrations. So again, I mentioned that I did this at Biosphere 2 and at Oak Ridge National Lab. At Biosphere 2, I had 3 different plantations, and each plantation, so they were these spots here. So this was the 400 part per million mesocosm, so it's 430 parts per million. That was 30 poplar trees, Populus deltoides, were exposed to for their entire life. In a completely separate mesocosm here, we had 30 more trees exposed to 800 parts per million, and another mesocosm here, we had 30 more trees exposed to 1200 parts per million. And again, this was their entire life cycle. It had been 3 years that they were growing under these conditions, and we're able to come in and capture a moment in time with regards to its carbon cycle. At Oak Ridge National Lab, I was dealing with these, it's called sweet gum, or the scientific name is Liquidambar styraciflua, and these plots were maintaining elevated CO2 inside the circles at 565 parts per million for 8 years. So really cool systems, big scale, big money systems. And that's one of the reasons that I actually went to the States to do this work, is we don't have anything like this in Canada. So when we look at a regular forest carbon cycle, there's a few different inputs that we can look at. We have inputs to the system, which are leaves do photosynthesis. That photosynthesis takes carbon in. It uses some of the new sugars that it's formed through photosynthesis to support tree growth, some of it just to support regular leaf respiration, and some of that carbon gets transferred down to the root level, which can support root growth, but can also support the secretion of organic acids at the root level in what we call root exudates into soils. And those root exudates help to feed microbial populations, fungal populations, and all of these end up with symbiotic relationships whereby the microorganisms or the fungi give the plant back nutrients in exchange for the carbon that the plant is giving to the microorganisms. So it's a really cool system below ground as well. So I was able to label the carbon dioxide that came in and then track it through a system. And so the respiration components are, again, like regular leaf respiration, regular stem respiration that we see in the woody components of the tree, root respiration, the respiration from microbes, and how much of what the plant has taken in 1 day gets transferred below ground, and of that, how much goes to microorganisms. You also have, from a respiratory pool, you've got decay of old residues within these systems as well. And then you've got soil-respired CO2, which is coming back to the atmosphere. So when we look at the amount of carbon that was actually taken in by photosynthesis, we call this assimilation of carbon. In the 400 part per million plot in the biosphere, we see that we had approximately 3-ish grams of carbon per meter squared brought in during 1 day. Almost doubles the amount of carbon that you're bringing in at 800 parts per million, and almost triples the amount at 1200 parts per million. And these are all, again, exactly identical forest types. Then if we look at the forest that is a much bigger forest, which exists in Tennessee at the Oak Ridge National Lab, we can see that here's approximately where our daily carbon assimilation, what it looks like. And again, remember that this is grams of carbon per meter squared. So when you do this per meter squared, if you've got a tree that's really tall, you end up with more leaves and biomass that can do photosynthesis than you have in trees that are shorter. So these poplar trees, to give you an idea, maxed out at probably 15 to 18 feet tall, whereas the trees in the forest, I went up on a 40-foot lift and I was not even at the top of the canopy, so they were probably 40, 50 feet tall. Okay, so really different size of trees. So I don't want you to equate, holy, this one's doing way more photosynthesis at less CO2. It's kind of an apples and oranges piece here. But in the following slides, I'll split them into ways that we can actually compare them. So when we look at a metric for understanding how much comes in and how much goes out, this can actually be called carbon use efficiency. So the amount of carbon that actually gets brought in through photosynthesis is the carbon that is assimilated, and the amount of carbon that gets retained in that system, whether it's below ground or above ground in biomass, is called NPP, or net primary productivity. And we can figure out our carbon use efficiency by looking at the amount of carbon retained in the system divided by the amount of carbon that's brought into that system. So then it becomes a percentage or a proportion. So when we look at Biosphere 2, I did these experiments at multiple different times of the year, and what's interesting is at different times of the year you have different water availability, different light availability, so you actually see different amounts of photosynthetic activity. So for the 430 part per million Bay, our carbon assimilation was somewhere around here. And when we track the carbon that came into that system through the system, we can see how quickly it goes through the system. And then we can model it and figure out where it tails off. So when we model it, what we actually find is we get an instantaneous value of the carbon use efficiency. So what we find is that at 400 parts per million, approximately 23–24% of the carbon that comes in one day stays in the plant. Whereas at 800 parts per million, only about 20% of the carbon that comes in stays in the plant. And interestingly enough, when you go up to higher levels of carbon dioxide, all the way up to 1200 parts per million, we go back to seeing about 24% of the carbon that comes in any given day stays in that system for growth. Similarly, we looked at the same types of data for the FACE site at Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and we found that these plants typically have about a 40 to 50% ratio of carbon that stays in their systems. So what this means is a lot more of the carbon that comes in actually stays in the systems and contributes to overall tree growth, root growth, and carbon exudation below ground. So these carbon use efficiencies, or these percentage values, when we plot them out on a graph, what we can find is we can look at the differences between, does it look like we have a similar ratio for species differences? And the answer here is yes, it really does look like different species do different things. So for poplar trees, they are really fast growing. They are a softwood, and they just grow like crazy, but they do so by just having really quick and high carbon turnover, but they bring in lots at a time. Whereas at Oak Ridge, bigger, larger trees, their carbon turnover is much slower, and they keep carbon in their systems for longer. So this is kind of interesting when we start to think about the fact that forests in general cover approximately 397 million hectares in Canada. And to give you an idea, this is more than twice the area of the province of Quebec and about 10% of the world's forest cover. So we're talking about a huge amount of forest that Canada has, and that we then in turn have slowly been working our way through logging and in most cases replacing. So when we think about those values that we just talked about, what we can understand is that different species are going to grow more quickly, some are going to sequester more carbon for longer, and we can actually take the knowledge that we're learning from these types of experiments and employ them to have short-term carbon sequestration sinks as well. The data that I just showed you a minute ago is only a very small tidbit of a much larger study, but it's interesting to look at nonetheless to understand a little bit of these the carbon exchange that we see in forest systems. Okay, all right, so if we look at Canada's softwood trade, I should mention we could discuss Canada's hardwood trade, but our hardwood trade only makes up about 10% of our total lumber trade. So talk a little bit more about softwood, and you guys will probably do a lot more research on the different components for your study. So more than 600 mills produce softwood lumber in Canada, and Canada exports softwood lumber to more than 140 different countries around the world. Since 2002, Canada's exports to China have increased 25-fold and account for $1.6 billion annually. And our exports to South Korea, Southeast Asia, and the United Kingdom have also increased by more than 200% to over $700 million. So it is a relatively large trade for us, and the softwood lumber prices have been under fluctuation for some time. So to give you an idea, here is a graph that shows a little bit of a historic record of lumber prices. So the bottom line here is the actual price that people were paying for lumber. But then when we normalize it all for 2016 dollars, just to try and understand, because with inflation and everything, the question becomes, are we actually paying more for lumber now, like when we equate it, or are we paying less? And the answer is actually we're paying less for lumber now than we would have been proportionally back in the 1970s. But in general, if you just look at lumber values, they have fluctuated up and down over time. And the lumber values sort of tanked out in 2015. So we say that there was a currency-driven global lumber price slump in 2015, and this was due to market demand, and at that time there was a fair amount of extra lumber on the market because houses were not going up as quickly in the United States, and this had a big sort of backlog on Canadian lumber. We also had strong fluctuations in the Canadian dollar at this time, and so that also affected the price of lumber. And so then there were less exports during that time. So we had this overall currency-driven lumber price slump in 2015, but it started to improve in 2016, and you can see when we start to look at 2018, the prices have continued to go up. So here we've just got some different lines that show you different prices. So the purple line is looking at 2x10s, the blue line is looking at 2x4s, and the green line is sort of this overall lumber composite number. So what you can see is that we have had relative increases, and in the past year or so, we've had a steady increase in lumber prices as well. And this gives you a little bit of an idea. And again, the green is kind of the normalized line for all different lumber products. We've also seen some other interesting trends. The harvests of softwood have gone up and down over time. A lot of it, again, is market driven. But what we do find is that we don't have a great connection from a supply chain perspective in Canada. It's not a highly regulated supply chain, and more the industry is starting to get more sophisticated to make sure that they're pulling the right amount of lumber at the right time and all of those different components. The future of the forestry industry in Canada and its 230,000 workers is going to depend on the success of its continuing commitment to innovation and sustainable development in every area of the forestry business. This can be simple things such as cellulose fibers, biomaterials, even nanomaterials that deal with wood, and Canada is actually starting to invest in advancing these technologies as well. So one of the major challenges, though, that we see for the forest industry is that in 2017, almost 3.4 million hectares of forest burned, and this seemed like very significant. It seemed like there were wildfires everywhere, and this became a big concern for a lot of folks. But fires actually were responsible for less than 1% of Canada's forests in general, affecting less than 1% of Canada's forests in general. Actually, pests are a more significant threat, and they affect approximately 4.5% of the forested areas in Canada. So there are some significant components to pest control that we need to look into to preserve the forestry industry as well. All right, well, that is where I leave you guys this week. See you next week.